Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast with your hosts Brian Auten and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
But there are some things we do, standard procedures in a case like this, which often bring us results.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Brian Auten, and I'm joined by Chad Gross. And I want to encourage you to listen on through to this one. We're going to be reviewing some of our past episodes for the past number of episodes. And I think maybe you'll find some good insights from them. And if you're new to the podcast, I want to encourage you to listen as well, because you might get a real good taste about the sorts of topics we deal with, as well as some of the guests that we've had on and the sort of guests that we'll be having on in the future. So thanks for joining us and welcome, Chad.
Yes, I'm excited to do this. It's always nice to go back and think about and reflect on the interviews we've done. And I don't know about you. I know you've been doing this longer than me, but I still have moments where, this is an audio, of course, podcast, but we do it video so we can actually see who we're interviewing. And there are times I'm looking at the person thinking, I can't believe I'm actually talking to this person. I never thought this would be something I'd be doing. So it just continues to be a thrill, and I'm just so grateful to be able to do it.
I'm real grateful as well. Thank you, Chad, for staying with me this long. This is episode 72 since we rebooted the podcast before. If you're new to the podcast or whatever, I did maybe 150 interviews prior to our sort of going in stasis for a while, hiding under a rock and, shedding my skin and molting and such. And then I said, I want to do this again, but I need Chad with me. So we're 72 episodes into the reboot. And
wow.
So
hard to believe.
I looked back and I thought, every 25 episodes, maybe we should kind of do a review. I always get a lot out of that. And then I looked and I'm like, whoa, it's been like 35 episodes.
Yeah, when you sent me that via text, I thought, that can't be right. Is he miscounting or something?
I thought I counted like 3 or 4 times, like, wait, where's the last one? I think episode 35, we reviewed some. But
wow.
Stick with us. We're just going to talk a bit about the takeaways from some of them. But first, I've got some recommended reading, and after that, a podcast recommendation. I have to admit that this particular book, I kind of like, by an author called Eric Metaxis. I saw his book called Is Atheism Dead? And I'm just going to be completely honest. When I saw that book, I'm like, dude, where you been? Like, you're 20 years late, And I was like, dude, I hear that you're a great author and you've got all these bestsellers and now you're writing on this. Where have you been? Where were you in 2006? But I have this Audible subscription, and it happened to be one of these ones that's sort of like included in the subscription for like, you get a credit a month, and then there's certain ones that you could just download because they're included in the membership. So I'm like, this is my opportunity. 16 hours of audio, 2.5 times speed. I can do that. And I'm past halfway and I'm loving it. I totally changed my first impression. The title Is Atheism Dead? Is sort of a play on that Time magazine cover, Is God Dead?
Sure.
So he's basically saying, hey, everybody, all the evidence has been accumulating and no one's talking about it. It's sort of like if you gave Lee Strobel steroids. It's super readable. And he just takes you through all kinds of lines of evidence, the Big Bang, the cosmic fine tuning, the cell's design, archaeology, New Testament reliability, Old Testament archaeological. I'm like, wow, this is like the whole shebang. And I'm maybe 2/3 of the way through, but I'm really liking it. It's so readable, or listenable, I should say. And so highly recommended. Is for a great, just all full spectrum apologetics blast. So I really, really like the book.
I heard him get interviewed on Frank Turek's podcast about the book. And at first I thought something similar to you. I saw it being advertised on Twitter. Exactly what you thought. Where have you been? This seems like a dated topic. But after I listened to him, he did make clear on the podcast that his approach was very much what you just said, that there's new evidences and arguments and discoveries that are being made, but it seems like kind of in the mainstream, it's not being really discussed or brought out. And I don't know if in the book he even says suppressed, but it's kind of hinted at there in the interview. Yeah, it's definitely good to hear that it's a good good overview of all those things.
Now I know why he's like won so many awards for being a great writer. You know, we've heard like William Lane Craig talk about Fred Hoyle and the telescopes and, you know, going up in the observatory and seeing the cosmic background radiation. But the way he tells the story, man, and it's amazing. You're like, wow, now it brings it to life. It's like, wow, full color. It's great.
Excellent.
It would be one you could recommend to pretty much anybody to read.
Excellent. Well, I am actually reading a book right now, too, that you recommended a long time ago, at least over a year ago, or maybe a little less than that, by Craig Hazen. And not exactly an apologetics book, but it's called Fearless Prayer, Why We Don't Ask and Why We Should. And he takes the verse, John 15:7, where Jesus said, if you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. And he kind of wrestles with the fact that he actually realized one day in his devotions he didn't really believe that. And he started unpacking the passage, and it's just a call, a reminder to Christians that God does love you, that he does care for you, and that he does want to provide for you, and he wants you to ask. And as you know, I've been dealing with some health issues that I kind of keep hitting a wall on. It kind of just drove me to that of like, maybe I need a fresh view of how to communicate with the Lord. And it's definitely brought that.
I'm glad to hear that. It's a challenging book in a sense, but at the same time, so encouraging.
Yes. Well, and wasn't it neat in the book? Like, I don't think I've ever read a book on prayer that he actually makes a case briefly, like an outline, but like a brief case for the truth of Christianity based on evidence.
Yeah.
And he says, look, you know, this isn't just hokey kind of we're throwing up and hoping somebody up there hears it, but like this is Christianity's based in evidence and reason. And I think that fuels your prayers. And I thought that was really refreshing to see that approach because you don't often see that. And also it was really nice because we have such an anti-intellectual bend in the church nowadays, which I think we're coming back, but we got a long way to go.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing that. So I want to recommend a podcast this week. If anyone's listening who's familiar with Wintry Night, he has a blog at wintrynight.com. We'll link to that in the show notes. But we'll also link to his new podcast with his co-host, Desert Rose. So it's called The Night and Rose Show. And they cover a variety of topics from an apologetics perspective. They're both very strong in apologetics, and they have a great chemistry together. So they've only got a couple episodes released, but I'm aware of probably 8 more in the pipeline, and I'm privy to the details. Maybe we'll find out more about that when they come on the podcast soon to be interviewed about it. So we'll talk a bit about that. What's your thoughts initially on their podcast, Chad?
Yeah, well, he was kind enough to send it to me to check it out. And man, I thought it was clear. I thought it was concise. I thought the way they presented the content, it was on the minimal facts argument for the resurrection. And I thought it was very applicable. And a Christian who was not familiar with that argument could listen to that podcast and have a pretty good idea of how to interact and use the argument. They pointed out a plethora of resources. They have those in the show notes. So I'm looking forward to listening to episode 2 called Becoming Bulletproof on the Battlefield.
Talking about some great topics there, and we'll point you that direction in the show notes. All right, listeners, we want to get your feedback, and in exchange, we want to give you something. We want to hear your feedback about the podcast. What do you want to hear more of? What do you want to hear less of? Have you got a favorite podcast guest that we've had on and you want to hear them back again? We've got a survey for you, and we'll link that in the show notes like everything else. So we want to hear your feedback about the podcast. And for those who fill out the survey, which we'll link to in the show notes, we will enter you into a draw for a free gift of your choice. So please check out that link to the survey, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Yes, and just know that if on the survey you put we'd like to hear less Ghostbuster quotes, that will be ignored.
All right, we want to give you a little preview of a few upcoming guests. Wintry Night will be joining us soon, along with Desert Rose, about their new podcast and what the sort of topics they're going to be covering. Vocab Malone will be joining us for the topic of street-level apologetics. Really looking forward to that. And Casey Luskin will be joining us to talk about intelligent design. He's been on the podcast before, so we're looking forward to those, but there's some other guests we can't even tell you about yet.
We're still working on it.
You just have to stay tuned. All right, Chad, let's talk about some of these interviews that we've done starting with Lenny Esposito. He talked about cultural apologetics. We had Lenny Esposito join us for the topic of cultural apologetics, and I really enjoyed that one because he was talking about a lot of the cultural values we have are grounded in the Christian worldview and how we can transition from those sort of cultural talking points to Christian truth. And he also talked about how superhero movies illustrate cultural values. And that was when Chad and him went on this, they started speaking another language because it was Marvel talk or something.
Yes, I believe we talked about The Dark Knight as well, which is DC Comics, to be fair. But no, I agree. I enjoyed that. And I think that it's just really important that even if we're not necessarily into certain cultural topics, I think he demonstrated that to be somewhat familiar with them can allow us to have bridges to talk to people about Christ. And I like the way that he's thinking in that way. And I appreciated that about the interview.
Mm-hmm. All right, we're going to move quick through these. Pastoral Apologetics with Phil Fernandes was episode 37. I love Phil Fernandes. Really cool stories he talked about with like different apologists. And of course,
Yes.
his accent's amazing. But talked about pastoring and apologetics, how they relate to one another, advice to pastors on the need for apologetics, a few other topics. But that was enjoyable. Hopefully, we just have him on again.
Yeah. Anytime I hear a pastor talking to other pastors about the necessity of apologetics, I'm all in, because we can't approach our congregations anymore as if everybody that is hearing us believes the Bible. You could do that 50 years ago, maybe, but you can't do that anymore. And so I loved hearing Pastor Fernandes talk about that. And I also love to see how engaged he is in apologetics to the point of even doing debates.
Yes, absolutely. So we had a listener question, and they emailed in asking, difficult question about, well, what about people who have not heard the gospel? What about original sin? Things like that. So we had on episode 38, Kurt Jaros come on and join us and talk a little bit about that question and discuss it. And that was an enjoyable conversation.
Yeah, it was. I learned a lot, and it gave me a lot to think about.
39, The Power of Testimonies with Eric Manning. Eric Manning runs this great YouTube channel I subscribe to called Testify. Great little 4 or 5, 6-minute videos, animated, revolving around the reliability of the Gospels, evidence for the New Testament documents, maximal facts approach to defending the resurrection, and a few long-form interviews with the likes of J.P. Moreland or other New Testament scholars. And we just talked with him about minimal facts, maximal facts, pros and cons, and evidence. It was really enjoyable. Love Eric.
Yeah, I always enjoy talking with him, and I also appreciate so much the clear, concise nature of those videos. They're so well done. They're so well thought out. They're done in a way that they're very engaging. They're not super long, which is unfortunately really important nowadays, because if you put up a video that's too long, it isn't going to get watched. So I think he keeps a good length to them. So yeah, I definitely recommend that YouTube channel for sure.
Yeah, we have YouTube on our smart TV, sort of Apple TV deal. And so that's one I subscribe to, along with like fail videos and Daily Dose of Internet and things like that. But, short little 1 minute, 3 minute, 5 minute videos. And the kids will be like, hey, anything to watch? And we'll watch a few fail videos. And then once in a while, I'll be like, oh, this one looks like, I want the kids to hear this. And we'll play something about the resurrection or whatever. And it's like throwing them apologetic bits and pieces, here and there.
Yes.
Just kind of weave into the daily viewing, if you will.
Yeah, that's a great idea to do that.
All right. So in episode 40, we entitled that Rationality versus Bigotry. We gave a book preview for J. Warner Wallace's new book, Person of Interest. And then, Chad, you presented your argument about this idea that disagreeing with homosexual behavior is not bigotry, but is rational and actually compassionate. I enjoyed that.
Yeah, and of course, if people are interested, I encourage you to go back and listen to that and give it a fair hearing. Hopefully it was helpful.
Episode 41, we talked about cultural apologetics with Paul Gould. What does going out and being a cultural apologist actually look like? Who's done some of the best work in cultural apologetics? How can we engage with culture today using culture and, springboarding from culture? How can we affect culture? So that was a really helpful discussion. If you're interested in that, his book is great as well.
Yeah, I like how he laid out that Acts 17 is the model for cultural apologetics. and how you have to address kind of the longing that you recognize with someone first, and then present them with the argument and show them how Christianity addresses that longing. And I thought that was really helpful. And of course, he made so many good book recommendations. If I tried to read all the books he recommended, I think that would take me all year. And so that was also helpful. And I always like a good book recommendation.
Episode 42 was Spiritual Warfare with our guest Karl Payne. I really thought this one stood out as obviously not directly apologetics related, but we talked about spiritual warfare. He uses a threefold model to describe demonic influence, like oppression, demonization, and possession. So it's not just like, you don't have devils. No, you're full of devils and you're possessed. There's like a little bit of a spectrum there, or at least 3 ways you could categorize that. And also, how do we discern what our enemies are according to the scripture? It's not just demons, it's the world, the flesh, and the devil. You know, what's the difference between these things like demonization and, say, mental illness? How do we deal with them? Very enlightening, amazing book, Spiritual Warfare by Karl Payne. And if you're interested in that, or if you're even struggling with what you think may be demonization, or, you know, your spiritual walk in that regard, that would be a good one to check out. I found it very helpful.
Yeah, and I think I would add on to that. I mean, a lot of the things you mentioned are what I planned on saying. The only thing I'd add on to that is I think his view, that kind of that pie, if you think of it as a pie of the world, the flesh, and the devil, also how to explain demonic activity that we see in Scripture. Mm-hmm. I think his model makes the most sense of that, and really kind of answer some questions that I've had before, especially in reading through the Gospels.
Episode 43 was Person of Interest with J. Warner Wallace. That's the title of his newest great book. Talks about the fuse and the fallout leading up to Jesus and after the life of Jesus. It was really an interesting, deeper dive from some of the ideas in his book from a cold case perspective, looking at the life of Jesus without taking the New Testament documents into account.
Yeah, he basically looks at science, art, music, literature, world religions, and argues that Jesus is the kind of the person of interest in the center of those, and that we wouldn't have those in the way that we do without Jesus. I like the modesty of this book in the sense that it wasn't trying to prove necessarily the deity of Christ. It wasn't necessarily trying to overreach. It was just saying, look, even if you don't take the scripture seriously, since Jesus is at the center of all these things you care about, then maybe you should take the scripture seriously, right? So it was just I like how he used it as almost like a billboard to point toward Jesus as somebody that you should take seriously. So I thought that was well done.
Yes. Right. Episode 45. Listener, if you're dealing with doubt, you might want to check out this one. And there's another one I'll recommend when you're dealing with doubt. But we took a listener question on episode 45. And so I gave advice for dealing with doubt, and so did Chad. And that's all we're going to say about that. Doubt is real, and a lot of things having to do with apologetics can assist with maybe bolstering your faith or dealing with intellectual doubts, but, even some encouragement as well from that podcast. So we'll point you there. Episode 46, we had a cornucopia of topics. Talked about Paley, we talked about John Wesley, we talked about intelligent design, talked about listening to debates. So if you like the cornucopia episodes, go to episode 46. Now, episode 47, we had Karl Payne back on due to popular demand. We were talking specifically about demonization. Remember, we were talking about in episode 42, spiritual warfare, which is not demonic warfare. It's the world, flesh, and the devil. So let's take that one slice of the pie, demonization, or dealing with demons, and we'll talk specifically about that. So if you were looking from episode 42 about, tell me all about demons, that's not necessarily the episode. It's part of the episode, but this one is all about demonization with Karl Payne, difference between, demonization and oppression, different accounts that Karl Payne has had when he's been walking people through deliverance and prayer for these sorts of things. How can people pray for themselves or help others, advice for people in that regard. So again, really insightful and not specifically apologetics geared, but when we're talking about apologetics, we are ministering to people, and, their intellectual doubts are not the only thing that we should be concerned about. So that might be another good one to equip you in that area. So episode 48 was Girl Talk Apologetics with Susan Morales. So Susan Morales came on and spoke to us about her ministry, Girl Talk Apologetics, which she runs with another couple of gals. And we talked about, women being active in apologetics, what that ministry is, challenges for homeschooling, advice for moms wanting tips for apologetics and parenting. Since that interview, I just keep following her channel and the stuff that she puts out, and she is producing a lot of great content. And so if you're looking for a good YouTube channel when it comes to apologetics, especially from a woman's point of view, that might be one to check out. So we'll link to that, of course, in the show notes.
Yeah, and I would say, too, I think it's exciting to see when we interviewed way back Sarah Interline, one of the things we talked to her about was the lack of women in apologetics. And so I'm excited about that ministry and encourage any ladies who want to get into apologetics. I mean, you can join this Girl Talk Apologetics. You could do it from the comfort of your own home. They've had people on, for example, like Greg Kokel, talking to him. And so I would encourage you to check that out if you want to learn more.
All right. So episode 49 was about evangelism and apologetics with guest Dave Sterrett. Now, not only does Dave write really well and make great books, but we talked about his book, Jesus Conversations. But man, go back and listen to that interview. If there's a top 5 to go back and listen to that one. It is inspiring. Yes. It's so genuine. And there's something about him that really leaves an impression in a positive way. And maybe you can catch some of that spirit that he has when you listen to that. But go back and listen to that one, episode 49, about evangelism.
I quite agree with that. One of the things I said, and I wrote a review on Truth Bomb of his book, Jesus Conversations. And one of the things I said is what makes me so happy about writing this review is I can certainly recommend the book, but I can even more so recommend the man. And it's because he just really is the real deal. We hear so much about Christians who are faltering, Christians who are walking away from their faith or not representing Christ in a way that honors him. But here's somebody that I can point to who just loves his wife, loves his kids, loves Christ, and is living for him and also through doing a regular job.
Yeah.
And that's significant as well. And so I agree with you completely. Of all the podcasts we've done, that's one that stands out. Of after talking to him, I thought, wow, it was challenging. Like, Chad, you need to get serious like that guy.
Yeah. It makes me feel like, some people, you want to know what they know. And then other people, you're like, I want to be more like him. Just,
yes.
You know what I mean? And I think it's a spiritual thing to a certain extent where you just feel like that's just a person of integrity. And somehow I want more of that,
And that also reminds me, we need to have him on to talk about aborting Aristotle.
Yeah. In episode 50 and 51, Chad could not join us. He got the COVID.
I really got the COVID. But anyway, go ahead.
So instead, I did a replay of a J.P. Moreland interview from times past. And the reason I played that was because I loved that interview and it was really helpful. And in going back and listening to it, I thought, this has not aged. This is great. This is like if we did it last week. Relevant, helpful, insightful. So I wanted to point people to that again. Episode 51 was an essay of mine entitled The Wise Man Seeks God. And that's just my own sort of essay, sort of a Pascalian appeal to seek after God. He's out there. There's enough evidence to warrant a search, but you can't find him without that search and seeking out and looking. And if you're truly wise, you'd spend your whole life searching for the God who is there. Now, the next one was episode 54, Talk About Doubts with Jonathan McLatchie. This was another notable one because I knew Jonathan was smart, but I didn't know just how smart until I heard him talk and was like, yes, it is confirmed. But if someone's dealing with doubt, you can just go to this website, talkaboutdoubts.com, and he'll basically hook you up with some expert to talk you through the areas you're struggling with. This is a ministry they're doing where, a lot of people are, if you want to call it, deconstructing their faith or walking away and, well, I don't think it's true anymore. Well, this is sort of a safety net or a ministry to help you not just, if you're having doubt, it's not necessarily a sin. You can talk to someone who has been down that road or knows exactly what that subject is all about and can give you some pointers and point you in the right direction.
Yeah, I mean, this was a direct kind of response to people reaching out to him, but also to kind of the deconstruction movement, people deconstructing from their Christian faith. And when Jonathan began talking to people, he was already doing this, and this was kind of his way of organizing it. And he's got some top-notch people that you can chat with about your doubts, and you don't have to be a non-Christian to do this. This is also for Christians who have doubts. And so this is definitely a resource you want to take advantage of. And again, I was very impressed with Jonathan McLatchie, not only his knowledge, but the way he goes about his ministry of being respectful and humble and something we all should model.
That was enjoyable. Episode 55 is actually our interview, me and Chad being interviewed by Susan Morales on her YouTube channel. So if you want to find out a little bit more about what we think about apologetics, our advice to people doing apologetics, if it's optional or required, and a bit about maybe our journeys through it, that would be one to check out.
Yeah, and also you can learn more about Brian's essay on apologetics and technology in the book A New Kind of Apologist, edited by Sean McDowell. He talks a bit about that, and it's a helpful essay who even people like Craig Hazen has commended. So it's definitely worth your time checking that out.
You're too kind. Episode 56 was Apologetics in Conversation. The premise behind this conversation that we had was, when we're talking to people who are not familiar with big scientific or theological or philosophical terms, how do we make complex arguments simpler? How can we turn big ideas into simpler statements? Or if even we're talking to kids, how can we interact with people on a practical level in conversation? That's our view on how to kind of break that down, stay focused in conversations. So a little bit more of a tactical episode as far as interacting with people.
Yeah, and I was grateful to do that because I think it allowed us to take what we've learned over the years from different thinkers and condense it and also use our own experiences. So hopefully it'll be helpful.
Yes. In episode 57, we started a primer on logic. And so that's part of the episode. But the episode itself is called, How Could Jesus Be the Only Way? And so you can sort of lead us through that. How could Jesus be the only way? And what about those who've never heard? Very helpful little conversation, both parts, I thought. Episode 58, we talked about artificial intelligence with our guest Christian Hubbs. Misconceptions about AI, how human-like can it become? Are there limitations? What's progressing the fastest? What about machine learning? How do these things relate to free speech? And what should Christians' views on these sorts of tools be? And so that was just a sort of a different episode there. So if you're into that sort of thing, we'll point you to episode 58.
Yeah, I was just a little upset to find out we weren't living in a simulation. That's all I have to say.
You don't know that, Chad. We've been through this, right? Moving on.
That is true. That's true.
Episode 59, Logic and 7 Characteristics of a Mature Thinker. So I went on and talked about the building blocks of logic, and Chad went on and talked about 7 characteristics of a mature thinker. Episode 60 was Advice for Apologists. So basically, we looked up some timeless advice from Christian apologists for those doing apologetics. So we took advice from a dozen different apologists and took their quotes, and we talked about it. And again, a more of a tactical episode, something that would help us think about how we're doing apologetics, how we interact with others, our place in the body of Christ as it relates to how we defend the faith or make a case for Christianity.
Yeah, and I really appreciated that quote you shared there, forgive me, I can't remember who said it, but the quote was, "Be as holy in the shadows as you are in the light."
Greg Koukl.
And Greg Koukl. And I like that because it does remind us that, yes, it's important to know arguments and to be able to offer evidence and to give a reason for the hope that is within us with reason and respect. But at the same time, we also want to make sure that our lives are consistent with our message.
Seeing we had been talking about logic on previous podcasts, in episode 61, we had the Jedi Master, Ken Samples, come and talk about logic with us. So, Christians don't have to be intimidated by it. So we talked all about it and sort of continued our journey in logic by talking to Ken Samples. So there's some really good links as well to some of his materials if you're interested in going deeper on that.
Yeah, and it's always a pleasure to talk to Dr. Samples, and I just think he is a model of Christian work and behavior.
Absolutely. All right, episode 62, we spoke with Mary Poplin about her book, Is Reality Secular? So we talked a lot about worldviews, worldview approaches, secular humanism, material naturalism, pantheism. So that was a real worldview episode. And, she has a lot of insight. And we even had a little bonus content towards the end where she was talking about Mother Teresa and her experience in Calcutta. Very different interview. And I like that.
Yeah, it was interesting to hear her perspective, too, on Christopher Hitchens' book, The Missionary Position, that he wrote kind of in response or in criticism to Mother Teresa. Also, I like the idea of thinking about worldview and which worldview best explains the evidence, kind of, that inference to the best explanation or abductive reasoning. And I thought her book was a great example of that.
Yes. Episode 63 was an unintentional episode, if you want to call it that. It ended up being my story of experiences in a church that was highly influenced in the New Apostolic Reformation. And so basically I just read Doug Guyvett and Holly Pivick's great books, God's Super Apostles and the New Apostolic Reformation. I was just going to give a book review, and then I started going and talking endlessly about that experience. But the interesting thing was I got a whole bunch of emails in response to that saying, yeah, I've been through the same sort of stuff. And they were relating their experiences and coming out of it or how it influenced them. So that was sort of a teaser for episode 66, which I'll jump ahead to here, where Doug Guyvett and Holly Pivick joined us to talk about the New Apostolic Reformation, or the NAR movement. Of the ones we've done in the past, this batch, this is in the top 3 for me. As far as I really think it's something that needs to be right at the forefront and being dealt with, this new apostolic, so-called New Apostolic Reformation movement. And so I think both Holly and Doug are excellent thinkers. They've done their research and they address the topic in a very clear, thoughtful, and respectful way on a really important topic.
No, I couldn't agree more. In the NAR movement, as you know, was not something that I have experienced myself, but obviously I've known your story, and my wife was saved in a church that was very influenced. I mean, it was a New Apostolic church. And so this was very eye-opening to me and challenging, and it also made me question, as I think I said on one of our NAR podcasts, that we should spend more time as apologists responding to this type of, what I would say in some cases, nonsense or misguided theology, because I think it can be just as detrimental, if not more detrimental, than skepticism.
Absolutely. One of our upcoming podcasts, what I want to do is go right through one of their appendices in their book, all the NAR terminology, and just go through it and talk about it.
I love that idea.
Because,
I love that idea.
It's one way to identify if the church you're in is being influenced by that, but also certain words say one thing, they mean another. What do you mean by prophecy? What do you mean by prophet, apostle? But
yes.
If you certain terminology like impartation or breakthrough, a lot of different NAR buzzwords, it would be helpful to go through those to talk about how those crop up and maybe how they're used or misused.
Yeah, and admittedly, that was one of the things I took away from the interview was what NAR, the New Apostolic Reformation movement, means when they use some of those words is quite different than my understanding that I try to base on Scripture and what I've been taught. And so, I mean, even the idea that they set up prophets in such a way that they can be wrong but still be prophets.
Yeah.
That was eye-opening to me. I was not aware of that.
Well, moving back and moving on, episode 64, we entitled Rules of Engagement. So Chad and I were observing what was going on in the apologetics community, it seemed, in certain circles, where I think things could have been done a little bit better. There was a lot of disagreements, but it was seemed to me to be divisive and non-charitable. And so we talked about, as apologists and Christians, how should our interactions be, especially when we're disagreeing with one another, and what's appropriate. Should we be making memes, making fun of people, mocking people? Should we be using sarcasm, that sort of a thing? And so it was a good discussion, and we had a guest on, Jacob Varghese of Saft Apologetics, and it was good to get his perspective.
Yes, yeah. Out of all the podcasts we've done, this is one that I enjoyed doing, but at the same time, I hope is listened to and taken to heart. We, of course, don't have the market cornered, and we slip and fall as well in this area. But that's one of the things that we need to remember is the way that we treat each other can honor the Lord or displease the Lord, but also that we're being watched by a skeptical community, and people are supposed to know we are Christians by the way we love one another.
Yes. Well, back to logic in episode 65, where we had our great guest with us, Travis Dickinson, talking about his book, Logic in the Way of Jesus, which became our new favorite logic book to recommend to people from a Christian point of view. Logic in the Way of Jesus, Thinking Critically and Christianly. Enjoyable talk. Loved it. Great conversation.
I think anybody who listened to the podcast will know how enthusiastic I was about the book and also about Travis. He's just very easy to talk to. I loved his formulation of the argument from reason, which has been one of my favorite arguments to think about for a long time. And I just think that he did a great job also pointing out that Jesus is a logician. And not only was he morally excellent, but he was logically excellent, or excellent in logic, however you want to say it. And so I really appreciated that about him. And I also just think it provided a really great introduction to logic. It gave you enough to chew on and challenge you, but at the same time, not enough to choke you, which, as you've pointed out, Brian, a lot of the logic books sometimes can.
Another great and enjoyable guest, Doug Groothuis, was with us on episode 67. He had just come out with his second edition of his huge apologetics book, Christian Apologetics, Comprehensive Case for the Christian Faith. Talked about two different things. We talked about the argument from beauty, and then we talked about divine hiddenness. So a lot of great insights from Doug. My wife listened to it. She says, he's so easy to listen to. And I thought about it, and I'm like, yeah, you're right. He's very calm, very clear, very sharp thinker, very insightful. And of course, his work is amazing.
Yeah, I thought it was great to see that him highlight the argument from beauty and then, of course, address divine hiddenness, or the so-called problem of divine hiddenness. And I think that anybody that is interested in those two topics would glean a lot from that podcast, but also should check out his second edition of Christian Apologetics.
Mm-hmm. We're coming to the end here, folks, but there's a couple more we want to tell you about. And one that I enjoyed quite a bit, episode 68 was entitled Apologetics and Parenting, and had Brett and Erin Kunkel from the ministry called Maven. You can find their stuff at maventruth.com. But we talk all about a worldview approach when it comes to parenting, discipling our kids, a lot of discussion about devotions and weaving in intentional discipleship of our children and teaching them the Christian worldview. I really was encouraged by it a lot. I do want to point people to their podcast, the Maven Parent Podcast. You can find that at maventruth.com/podcast. But one thing was a side effect of that is Erin Kunkel co-hosts a podcast called the Strong Women Podcast. And my wife downloaded that, has been listening to it because she says it's an amazing podcast. And I listened to a few episodes of it, and I'm like, yeah, that is an amazing podcast. Thank you. Wow. I appreciate Brett and Erin. They're fantastic and appreciate what they're doing. And that was an enjoyable conversation. All right, episode 069, we talked all about Pascal and his thoughts, the pensée. And so we talked about apologetic methodology, Pascal's experience with God, his reflections on distraction, the state of man. And we spent a good time talking about the hiddenness of God and the need for humility in approaching God, and how Pascal would appeal to his culture and how maybe some of these insights apply to us today. And it was just basically me trying to convince you guys to read Pascal.
Yes, and one of the things I really took from that is, do you remember when you were telling me that there is a thinker that you're friends with who mentioned to you that a lot of modern arguments have already been responded to in really great ways by older authors?
Yes.
I think that Pascal's response to the hiddenness question does not get highlighted enough or talked about enough.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. We'll talk about one more, episode 70, Jesus is God. Did Jesus really claim to be God? So we talk about Jesus' personal claims, his actions. We basically looked at the question, did Jesus really claim to be God? What did he do? What did he say? What role did he assume? Which actually demonstrated that his divinity. And I thought it was a powerful case, basically an apologetic that affirms the statement, Jesus is God, by all the things he said, did, acted, and assumed.
Yeah, I actually went back and listened to that, and I thought that was a great introduction into how to answer that question and some of the reasons that Christians throughout history have come to the conclusion that he is God the Son.
Listeners, thank you so much for joining us. And how long have you been listening for? We would really love to know if you're a recent listener. Have you been listening forever? How many episodes do you download and how many do you delete? Well, all these sorts of questions and more, we'll just point you over to this survey that we've put together. Thanks so much for doing that. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time. Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you have a question you'd like us to address or just a message for us, feedback, good or bad, you can either email us at podcast@apologetics315.com or leave a voice message for us using SpeakPipe. Just go to speakpipe.com/apologetics315 to leave us a message. And remember, if you include a Ghostbusters quote in your question, we guarantee that we'll read it on the podcast. We also ensure up to 50% better quality answers. Also, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave a review in iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice. And please share this episode with a friend if you found it useful. Remember, you can find lots of apologetics resources at apologetics315.com, along with show notes for today's episode. Find Chad's apologetic stuff over at Truthbomb Apologetics. That's truthbomb.blogspot.com. This has been Brian Auten and Chad Gross for the Apologetics 315 podcast, and thanks for listening.